Good morning, everybody. I don't see the other participants in the room. And I would like to greet everybody in the name of the organizers of the webinar. I have been invited and I am your coordinator of the session today. I'm very honored to have been asked for this function, this contribution. I wish that I can keep the standard of the excellent day that pass the words to the first speaker. I understand is Mr. Lee, right? It,
Thank you, Professor Luiz Guilherme. So I'm Natalia Gomide from the British Consulate here in Belo Horizonte, and I would like to thank you all for joining the webinar today. And first, thank you ABMS, the Brazilian Association of Soils Mechanics, and especially Professor Schneider, who invited us to join the webinars, and also Professor Luiz Guilherme de Mello, who is here with us today. So from the part of the British government, it is such a topic, important topic to be collaborating, and I hope that today's webinar will begin this fruitful collaboration between the British government and ABMS here in Brazil. And as mentioned by our consul yesterday, Mr. Lucas Brown, the British Consulate, since 2015, we started working to contribute proactively in the agenda of safety, transparency, and innovation for the mining management here in Brazil. I'm leading the mining team for the British Consulate here in Belo Horizonte. And I led, in a partnership with the UNEP, UN Environmental Program Office here in Brazil, a series of roundtables related to the new tailings management for here in Brazil. And we promoted these webinars to promote this important topic here in Brazil. And we see that the topic of ESG and other environmental topics really important, are becoming really important here in Brazil. And we recognize that collaboration between academia, technical, and professional in excellency here in Brazil, and we want to keep this collaboration. And for today's, we have seen that there is an improvement for a dry stacking here in Brazil, and we could see in the yesterday's webinar some really excellent presentation. So I would like to invite you all to watch also the yesterday's webinar, in which Vale and also Night PSO presented more about the geotechnical part for the dry stacking and what are they working here in Brazil and across the world. And for today's webinar, we are going to have an excellent speech from two specialists related to the legislation and regulation for dry stacking, which is becoming a trend here in Brazil. As we are approaching in more operations having dry stacking, we need now to have more. We need to regulate, because even though dry stacking is a new trend and in a safer system than the tailings dams itself, it also has geotechnical issues, and it needs to be regulated by the government. So for today, we are going to have the presentation for Professor Robert Lee, who he has experience working with the Welsh government in the UK, with the legacy of the coal dry stacking, and also Vicente Mello from AECOM, who is working here in Brazil to discussing what should be a good regulation for the systems here in Brazil. So I will pass now back to Professor Luiz to introduce Professor Robert Lee, please.
Thank you, Natalia. I would like just to add, if you allow me to, that the British government has been putting webinars. This is, as far as my knowledge goes, the first webinar which is interlinked with the Brazilian Society of Soil Mechanics, but I have been invited and I have participated in excellent two previous webinars sponsored and coordinated by the British government on the topics of tailings and mining industry. So it's a pleasure to be here. I would like to invite the first speaker of this morning program, Professor Robert Lee from the University of Birmingham. He will be discussing and presenting the regulations for disused coal tip mines in Wales. As an old student of the Imperial College, I had the privilege, but I was also shocked to study the Aberfan disaster back in the late 60s, having lessons with Professor Alan Bishop in the Imperial College in the University of London. Professor Robert Lee is a professor of law at Birmingham Law School, a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences, a fellow of the Royal Society of Medicine, who holds a higher doctorate for his work on technologies regulations. We are pleased to have Professor Robert Lee with us, and we are eager to hear you, Professor Lee. I pass the word on to you.
Thank you very much. Let me just try and share my slides. There we are. So thank you very much for the introduction, Luiz. I'm going to start fairly quickly by talking about the Aberfan disaster, which you referred to. But by way of introduction, let me just say that I have a research project which is called Met4Tech. It is a UKRI-funded centre for circular economy, and we work particularly on technology metals. So we work on those metals that will be necessary to drive a green economy. I also live in Wales, and this is about 25 kilometres from where I live. I'm not sure why the first slide has not shown, but this will do. This is the Aberfan disaster. This is a coal tip, one of 7 that belonged to a coal mine. And in 1966, in a period of heavy rainfall, the tip slid down the hill. And unfortunately, the epicenter of the damage was this building here. And that is a primary school. It was a school for children between the ages of about 5 and 11. 144 people died, 116 of whom were children. So it's against that background that I'm doing some work with the Welsh Government on the stability of coal waste. And I will come on to that later. I think it's important to say that, we are going back now, looking at this to 1966. In terms of dry stacking, geotechnical advancement has been good. We would now be much better at filtering, at dewatering, at thickening this waste. So everything I say in that context. In the aftermath of this accident, legislation was introduced, and in 1969, that came into effect. And it drew a distinction between active tips that were still being used by the mines, and closed stacks. For active tips, what was suggested was better design, construction, and maintenance of those tips at the planning stage. And there was a regime of weekly inspections with inspection reports, and that inspection process was monitored. I won't say any more about that because the law in this respect has changed. But the focus of this legislation was primarily on active mines. It assumed that there was a mine that was operational, and therefore that the inspection process could take place as part of the operation, and the maintenance could go on as part of the operation. The second part of the Act dealt with closed tips, tips that had belonged to a mine, but the mine had now been, let's say, abandoned, leaving a tip still there. For those closed tips, there was a much lighter regulatory regime. Inspection at the most every 6 months, but usually annual inspection once a year. The onus of the regulation fell on the local government authority for the area in question. Over time, between 1969 and now, local authorities are probably much less well-resourced and much less powerful than they were in the late 1960s. So this regime for closed tips, which still applies, has the local authority as the regime to monitor closed tips. And that is somewhat of a problem because, for example, how effective this will be depends on the geotechnical expertise within the local authority itself, and that may be somewhat limited. Also, in relation to closed tips, there were powers of intervention, but these were very limited. And of course, by the time that the tips had closed, not all of them remained in the ownership of the mining company. Many passed on into private hands. And there were very poor powers of access and control for mining waste on private land. There were no preventative powers in this legislation so that you could inspect, but then if you found that re-engineering of the waste was necessary, then in a sense you had to negotiate with the owner. And finally, there was no central agency. So there's a disbursement of regulatory tasks amongst different regional local authorities, but no central oversight of what those authorities do. Now, where we stand today is that for active tips, we have new legislation. But for closed tips, this legislation under the 1969 Act remains in place, and it is inadequate. Before I look at that further, let me go on and just talk about the modern regime for active mine waste. And it's handed down to the UK via the law of the European Union, via a mining waste directive, which was passed in 2006. That directive was introduced because of problems caused by mining waste. Although other than Aberfan, mainly the problems for that mining waste came from mine tailings. And mine tailing or mine dam failures in Italy, for example, in Spain, in Romania, all of those countries had very serious incidents and accidents. So the Mining Waste Directive controls both tailing dams and it controls dry stack waste. And the duty under the directive is to prevent and reduce as far as possible adverse impacts on human health and the environment. That regime applies all over Europe to every European member state, including the UK. And even though the UK is no longer a member of the European Union, in effect, this regime still applies because the UK law, which was rewritten in 2014, absolutely meets the requirements of the EU directive. But it applies only to waste facilities which either were operational by the 1st of May 2008 or which have become operational after the 1st of May 2008. So a mine that had closed before the 1st of May 2008, the dry stack waste is not regulated by these provisions. These provisions are a form of risk regulation, and they look to tailings and to dry stack tips, which are posing the most risk to human health or the environment. And in particular, it has a high risk category, which it calls category A, and it singles out the category A tips for special attention. Those category A tips are in that category because incorrect operation is likely to lead to major accident. So it's a mixture of the construction of the tip, but also what receptors or what things that might be harmed are in proximity of the tip. And a tip will also be a category A tip if the tip contains hazardous waste or dangerous substances. For those category A tips, day-to-day control is exercised in accordance with an agreed waste management plan. And that waste management plan will be agreed with the Environmental Agency for England and the equivalent in Wales. Major accident prevention plans have to be put in place and are monitored, and the mine permit will have written into it standards for operation and for engineering and aftercare provisions. And in relation to the aftercare provisions, you cannot get rid of your permit. You must maintain your permit until the regulator accepts its surrender, as we call it. Until the regulator accepts that the tip is now safe and adequately finished, and at that point, the license can be held by. So that is all the law in the UK and in European member states as well for active tips. But let me go back to closed tips and let me come forward to the present day. There are no deep coal mines in Wales any longer. They closed particularly in the mid-1980s after a long and bitter industrial dispute by the miners and the then government. So most mines in Wales, most coal mines in Wales certainly, are closed, and therefore most coal tips are now disused tips. And this is a photograph from February 2020. In the winter of 2020, the western part of the UK, which is where the Welsh valleys are, were hit by a series of transatlantic storms. And this is in the aftermath of a storm which was named Storm Dennis. And the water flow through one of the tips in a place called Tylerstown was such that the whole tip, as you can see here, came down the hill. And beyond this figure here in the photograph, behind the fence, there is a river valley and a river. 60,000 tons of waste were pulled out of the river, but actually probably many more thousand tons were dispersed along the accompanying hillside. Happily, no one was killed, although that was very fortunate because there is both a footpath and a cycle path along the river. Even more fortuitously, Storm Dennis had finished and the weather remained dry. So although there was some flooding from the river, it didn't really affect very many people. So a fortunate escape, but of course in Wales, and with memories of Aberfan and what happened at the school, the Welsh government took this incident very, very seriously indeed, and recognised that the 1969 Act, the Act put in place after Aberfan, was not fit for purpose. And so the Welsh government is now working on legislation. Let me just explain very quickly that laws in relation to the environment are devolved in the United Kingdom. So this is not legislation being passed by the United Kingdom government. It is legislation being passed within Wales by the Welsh Assembly, the Senedd, as we call it, and it applies to Wales only. But in Wales, there are more or less 2,500 disused tips, most but not all of them coal tips. So the new legislation proposes a new supervisory authority for closed tips. And that new supervisory authority will carry out hazard assessments of all of those 2,500 tips as its first task. And it will do so by a process of inspection, and that will lead to risk ranking of the tips, risk ranking into 5 categories, with the most severe category at the top. And that categorization will drive management plans for all of the closed tips. Some of those management plans for the less risky tips might be very simple indeed, such as occasional inspection. But for the more risky tips, there will be a process which the new supervisory authority will oversee of inspection, initial inspection, and then a higher level technical appraisal, and then finally an assessment by an accredited expert. And that expert will not be from the supervisory authority, that expert will be from a panel of geoengineers chosen for this purpose. And as part of their assessment, they will produce management plans for that tip. The legislation will include standardized reporting, so that there will be common standards of risk ranking, for example. And the legislation introduces maintenance agreements. As I said earlier, many of these tips are now actually passed into private hands, so that there will be an agreement between the supervisory authority and the present owner of that dry stack waste in terms of how we maintain the waste facility. Finally, there will be a power of emergency intervention, and that may take 2 forms. It may take the form of entering onto land and re-engineering the tip where there is a risk of failure, but it also includes emergency interventions to act in the aftermath of a tip failure. So a bit like my earlier slide, my previous slide, to immediately try and get the coal waste out of the river, etc. And that's sort of where my work comes in, because the thing that I have been working on with the Welsh Government is a potential clash between those emergency interventions to re-engineer or restore the tip and existing environmental laws. And really, there are 3 points of tension there. The first is that, of course, over time, and since many of these tips closed in the 1970s and 80s, they have gone very green. They have grown over with vegetation. And 150 of those tips now sit on sites which are scheduled, registered for nature conservation purposes. Now, ordinarily, if we were to do work on a conservation site, we could only do it by agreement with the nature conservation authorities. And those agreements take some time to put in place. But here we have emergency action. So one issue for the legislation is how to expedite emergency action should it be needed, where a tip is now an important habitat for flora or for fauna. Second problem, the movement of waste, the re-engineering of waste, or even the movement and rebuilding of that waste that's fallen into the river is, under our planning legislation, unquestionably what we would call a development. And every development needs planning consent. The minimum period that most planning authorities will make an approval of a consent is 8 weeks. But clearly, if there's been a major tip failure, we don't want to wait 8 weeks to intervene. Actually, that period may be much longer than 8 weeks if we require an environmental impact assessment. And we might require an environmental impact assessment, for example, where it is on a site of nature protection. It can take many months to prepare an effective environmental impact assessment. So the sort of stuff that I have been working on is to conduct the work under ministerial directions, under the control of the minister, and then, during the course of the work, prepare the environmental impact assessment simultaneously. Finally, all of this remains waste in the view of the law in England and Wales. So that when we're moving waste, pulling waste out of the river once the tip has fallen down, whatever it might be, all of that has to be subject to a waste permit, an environmental permit. And again, ordinarily, they would take time to negotiate. So I've been pressing for a scheme in which there could be expedited waste approvals in order for the work to go ahead in emergency. This is my final slide, but I just want to dwell upon two things. This is a picture of miners on their last day of work. Their colliery at a place called Ormond is closing. This would have been in the 1970s. And by 1986, pretty much all the deep mines in Wales, in which tens of thousands of workers had worked, are closed. They weren't really closed as a process of decarbonisation. They weren't closed to move away from coal. They were closed for other reasons. But many of these men would never have worked again. In fact, 25 years later, less than half of the coal mining jobs have been replaced by other work. So this created long-term unemployment. And even today, the Welsh Valleys has the highest rate of anywhere in the UK of working age benefit claimants. people who can't get jobs, or in some of these cases, people who are still suffering from industrial disease or injury as a result of their former working. And I make that point simply because in energy transition, as we move away from coal, and indeed eventually from oil and gas, there will be lots of economic dislocation. And I do think it's very important that that transition is a just transition, brings social and environmental justice. There's an irony in what I'm talking about here, because all of these guys dug out the coal which gave rise to global warming. Global warming has changed the winters in Wales, which are now much wetter as a result of these tropical storms than they used to be. Those much wetter winters are destabilizing these old and not always well constructed dry stack tips, causing landslides and threatening the very communities that dug that waste in the first place. And again, that's not really climate justice. So it's an interesting story. It's taken a long time to come about, but the story is, I think, that on the whole, we have a reasonably effective regime for active mines. We have a problem with closed mines, which the government in Wales, at least, is trying to address by reform of legislation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Lee, for your very interesting, broad perspective. And I personally think that, comments and contributions like what you just finished your speech with relation of the side effects, as you were, because the whole technical issue, in my perspective, has to see from a broad perspective. Sorry to be redundant with the word perspective. I now pass the word to Dr. Vicente Mello. Vicente is a good friend. We've been in very different challenges, working together. Vicente is the consulting company in Brazil, deeply involved into contributing for the stable or the assessment of stability, the stable certification, the stability certification, and the future perspectives on dry stacking and conventional tailing deposits. I am eager to hear Vicente, because I have followed that an interesting contribution with dry stacks is about to be presented to us. Vicente, can you step in the stage, please?
Sure, Luiz, Guilherme, thank you very much for the kind introduction. Likewise, it's been a long journey and a pleasure to interact with you, with Fernand Schneider as well, and a couple of the other participants in here. I will, share my screen. Is everyone seeing the screen?
Yes, Vicente, we are seeing. You can start now.
So I'll talk a little bit about, current scenario challenges and what's the regulatory context around dry stacking and mining waste piles. I think, the first is that, tailing dams and tailing piles are quite different. The yesterday discussion around the technical aspects and implication. What's quite interesting in bringing this up, it's also very interesting to hear the presentation around the challenges in Wales, bringing other issues, especially the ones related with climate change. Historically, our society has dealt with and managed wastes in general as an externality, of the production or the end product that is the ultimate aim, and currently, and even more in the future, as far as mining waste is concerned, this will have to become an integral part of the production and the revenue generation process. What are the main differences besides the technical aspects that were yesterday's discussion? But briefly, and at a high level analysis, when we start from the design, we do have very clear standards and legislation requirements related to tailings dams. When we move that to tailings piles, dry stacking, or mining waste piles, we do not have that luxury. Standards and legislations have gaps, or they are not as clearly defined as when we face that discussion on dams. The other significant difference is related to the lifetime of the structure and the life cycle of the structure. In a dam, there are very clear distinctions between the design, the construction, the operation, and monitoring, and the closure. When we move to a pile or dry stacking, design, construction, operation, and monitoring, oftentimes they occur in parallel along the lifetime of the structure. We don't have in a dry stack that moment when engineering has finished the construction and then commissions the dam, in a case of a tailing dam, and hand the dam over to operation to start depositing. We don't have that in a dry stack. So that also has implications related to the governance of the structure. There are very clear roles and responsibility among departments when we are talking about a dam. Engineering, operations, and the geotechnical department are very distinct, very separated, very clear segregations and roles and responsibilities. As the structure lifetime of a dry stacking or a pile creates the situation that design, construction, operation, and monitoring, they happen in parallel. We do have the same roles, engineering, operation, and geotech, but they do need to work differently, and oftentimes in a manner that they have never worked in the past and before. There is also difference related to failure mode, related to dams. It's a very mature understanding around what are the failure modes and what are the alternatives to monitor and to mitigate risks. It's a less mature understanding when we move that towards dry stacking. A lot of the discussion yesterday was around whether or not liquefaction is something that could, or how that's considered when we move to a dry stacking, So that also creates challenges related to what are the alternatives to monitor and to mitigate risks. And this finally cascades down to the failure consequences. It's very mature understanding and robust emergency plans related to dams. And it's a less mature field of knowledge when we're talking about dry stacking or tailing piles. When we analyze those differences and those implications in terms of what are the advantages and challenges, the legal and safety implications, and mining future and the use of dry stacking and tailing piles, Historically, mining waste and tailings have been managed as an externality. They do represent a cost, an unwanted, byproduct of the production process. Was interesting to hear the presentation that Rafael Bittar and Ana Rissoli did yesterday, sharing with us and with everyone the programs and the actions that Vale is trying to do to not see tailings as a waste any longer, but how could that be a product, and an end product to something, in the future, Although that's extremely interesting, the challenges on how to do that, given the scales that we're talking about in terms of tons and volumes produced of tailings and waste product, it's something to be tackled by the industry. There is also, the issue related to how clear or sometimes perhaps unregistered and undocumented risks and liabilities are, until a couple of years was, if you would read, the annual reports of, the big mining operators of the world, the word tailings dams was not there, So it's also an important aspect of how that potentially could be one of the biggest operation liabilities that a mining operator has, how that's registered in the annual reports and in the financial statements of the companies, Although piles can represent a potential lower impact and risk to the surroundings, they require at the same time major changes on how mining operators dispose and manage the waste and tailings. It's a very interesting opportunity, but one that needs to be taken very responsibly, and so that it's not the panacea or the Pandora boxes that's going to solve all the problems. The same way that very good designed and very well constructed dams are also a very feasible alternative. When we move to the legal and safety implications, historically the regulatory framework regarding tailings dam in Brazil have been through a dramatic improvement in the recent years. Most likely. The Brazil framework and legal framework on tailings dams in Brazil today is probably among the highest in terms of being rigorous in the world. That's not the case for piles. There are very significant gaps in the regulation regarding dry stacking and piles. Giving you one example, if you have a waste pile licensed, okay, as long as you does not change the geometry and you don't change the volume of the waste overburden pile that you have licensed, you don't need to relicense that pile. You just communicate to the environmental agency in Brazil that you are changing the material that you are depositing in the pile that you licensed as a waste product or sterile or overburden material, and you can start deposit tailings there. Even though the materials are totally different and they behave different and they have completely different consequences, you don't need an environmental impact assessment or a new license in order to do that. So that's a significant gap in the legislation, and those gaps could potentially create future risks that currently are unknown and could go unregistered. At the same time, with this perspective, either created by the failures in Brazil or by the changes in the regulation, by the difficulty in licensing new dams in Brazil, there's this increasing perspective of depositing more and more and using more dry stacking and piles as a structure, to deposit tailings, So it's a very, our understanding is that it's a very careful path that we need to take ahead of us. If you think about one important aspect that currently, when you talk about a dam as the primary structure, to dispose tailings, engineering designs and manages the construction of the tailing dam. Once the tailing dam is built, and commissioned, it's handed over to operations. Operations starts to deposit the tailings in the tailings dam reservoir, while the geotechnical area monitors the dam. In this new approach, engineering will design and build experimental pile, to understand compaction, equipment, moisture content, geotechnical parameters of the materials. Once, the experimental pile is concluded, you will start to build the pile. There's not a moment that construction stops. Construction and operation of the pile, they happens in parallel at the same time, The tailing pile is the construction. You don't have a moment that, it's in a very controlled environment, you build the dam. That happens in a pile when you're building the experimental pile to derive, the parameters that you're going to use. This creates that operation will no longer be able to dictate the pace of production. The pace of production will be dictated by the pace that you can stack the material safely, and we see that on the field. We are involved in several sites that mining operators are starting to move from the experimental piles to the actual dry stacking piles, and in the first years, Geotech, does not approve more than 70% of the layers that are deposited and built by operations. And then the operations oftentimes, based on the production targets that they are given in terms of the incentives that they have, present formal complaints. They can't meet the production deadline targets because Geotechnical is not approving the layers, and that's going to impact the company revenue. It's a uncharted territory. It's a new world that will require, a change in the culture, changes in the governance. Okay. A lot of that incentive to move towards dry stacking, it's going to come from the changes in the regulatory, basically the failures that happen in Brazil in the last, 20 some years, demonstrated, the need to have significant changes. I will go back to this in a moment. Okay. So there have been, 8 material changes in the regulation regarding mining dams in Brazil in the last 7 years alone. With the latest one now, published in February 2022, Resolution 95 from the National Mining Agency, creating new implications, This new legal frameworks, poses an increasingly difficult process to license new dams. You can't have, communities downstream. Now Resolution 95 also determines that for current dams, you either have to reinforce, remove the dam, or remove the communities. So this creates a situation that dams will become, prime time real estate, and being able to use new technologies to deposit tailings in stacks, this case, dry stacking, and reducing the volume for the material that you can't dry stack, and you need to continue to deposit behind a dam or in a pit, you know, and with that extending the lifetime of the dams will be a very important aspect in the future, you know. Among, you know, the other changes that are very focused, you know, on dams, there are significant improvements related to the engineer of record, brings for the first time in the regulation the so-called backup dams, you know, that were built in order to address emergency level 2 or 3 upstream raised tailings dams that need to be decharacterized, you know, new requirements related to the emergency plans, the geotechnical monitoring centers, the engineers of records, new rules related to what can be in the ZAS zones, what cannot be in the ZAS zones. And ultimately, if you read carefully Resolution 95 and you see this footprint 30, 40 years down the road, basically Resolution 95 creates a scenario that, you know, in 20, 30 years, there will not be communities living on ZASs of tailings dams in the future, okay? There's going to be a process that will be, either the communities will be moved out and resettled, or the dams will be removed so that the ZAS does not exist any longer. So this is the perfect scenario, you know, and we know by the number of dry stacking projects that are under development in Brazil today by most of the mining operators. There's a strong tendency towards using stacking or piles as a, you know, TSF, you know, all that under a regulation that is not there yet, you know, that is still under discussion, is still under development. You know, one could argue that this is, you know, the perfect scenario for a perfect storm in the future, you know. A strong push towards, you know, using this very interesting alternative to deposit, you know, and to dispose mining waste and tailings, but with the norms and the regulation, it's still not there yet, you know, under development, okay? There are, you know, many discussions technically, you know, that were highlighted yesterday around whether or not those drain stacks are susceptible to liquefaction, you know, and this creates further implications. You know, for the first time, ZAS, you know, Resolution 95, you know, brings this requirement that once, you know, the ZAS zone is defined in the map after the dam break study and the emergency plan, the municipalities will need to work in order to prevent that the land is not occupied by the communities. This is also a new challenge that we will all face together, you know. Some of the cities with significant mining sites, you know, have municipal development plans that were developed and voted in the houses of representatives in the past that did not consider this. And the land has been planned to be occupied by, you know, new neighborhoods, you know, new hospitals, schools, and to be occupied by, you know, the communities to foster the development of the municipalities. That will no longer be allowed, you know, after the publication of Resolution 95. Okay, something that we haven't faced in the past so far. Okay. Also internationally, you know, there is a very strong push, in terms of, the GISTM does not make a distinction between a dam or a dry stacking or other structures that are used, to contain or to receive or to dispose tailings. They name it as tailing storage facilities, although they are quite different, and they could and they need different approaches related to the specific regulations and standards that should be applied. Okay. So this creates a situation that we have a gap in terms of the technical and the regulatory, framework to reference the design, the construction, the operation, and the closure of, tailings piles. Okay. At the same time, there's a very growing, trend towards implementing and using more and more this type of technology. It's unclear, given the regulatory framework and the gaps that do not require, as you change the material that's going to be disposed, that do not require a new environmental impact assessment. So this creates a vulnerability on the safety and socio-economical environmental impacts. And there are different initiatives, that are being pushed, in order to address these gaps. There is a strong need for a specific new regulation focusing on dry stacking, tailings piles, and these types of, technologies to dispose tailings. One aspect is already part of our life. This is a picture of the empilhamento drenado, or the drained stack Xingu, owned by Vale. This is also the case, of the drain stacking Germano at the Germano site. And those structures that in the past were classified as drain stacking, currently they were reclassified as upstream tailings dams. They need to be decharacterized. This picture here demonstrates very clear, how this structure looks very different from a dam. We face the challenge of, discussing with Vale the dam break study of this, upstream tailings dam, and one of the biggest challenges that we have is if a failure occurs, the flow is going to take which direction? There are three phases here. Depending which phase you select, you create a different inundation map. That's a challenge that we do not face when we are discussing a embankment of a dam failure mode. Okay, just as an example. Okay. The regulatory frameworks and the laws that are out there, they touch superficially or briefly or generically when we are talking about waste piles and nothing specific related to a tailing or a dry stacking pile. Okay. We had this year, one of the first documented failures. This happened at the site owned by Valurec, the collapse of the Cachoeirinha pile. This also showed the combination of the failure, because oftentimes the arrangement that we see on site is that you have a pile, and then downstream of the pile you have a dike, to contain the sediments, what happened in the Valurec site is that as the pile, failed and had a slide, it entered into the reservoir and overtopped the Lisa dike in this case. We're gonna find similar arrangements in most of the mining sites in Brazil and in Minas Gerais. Dikes to contain sediments downstream of piles. Okay. The other challenge is that, different from tailings dams, we do not have a formal collective database of piles in Brazil. Okay, if the National Mining Agency wants to publish, the number of dams in Brazil, there is the SIGBM with all the dams, mining dams, properly registered there in terms of who owns, when was built, what's the volume, what's the type of construction. So we do not have that for piles. After the failure that took place in the Valurec site, there was an initiative to start to put together a catalog of piles, here in Minas Gerais, okay? And this first catalog, registered 238, tailings piles, mining piles, and we do know that there is a significant bigger number than that, okay? So the lack of a catalog, formal catalog and database that the regulator can use, to interact with the operators and to disclose this to the society is also a very significant gap in this case, okay? This first catalog was done by operators and then by municipalities, okay? The MPMG, and ABMS is also involved in this effort together with AECOM. It's very aware of this, the necessity and the need for a very specific, regulation. It mandated, the development of a technical and environmental guideline. This is a work that is being conducted by the University of São Paulo for the environmental aspects, and by AECOM for the technical aspects. ABMS is involved reviewing the technical aspects, and this technical guideline will present a framework, the legal requirements, project developments, stages of the structure, operation and monitoring, closure, and reclamation of piles. This document has been issued as a preliminary version for discussion and review, and it will try to present, a very detailed, technical guideline for the different aspects, from the very initial phases in, the design and the planning to the closure, passing through what are, the technical aspects and the monitoring, the operations, and finally, what are the standards and legislations in Brazil and in other, parts of the world. The idea here is, the objective here is to provide this to the Prosecutor Office of Minas Gerais, to FEA, and to the National Mining Agency, so that the regulators can take in consideration and eventually, publish a specific guideline and norm, and regulation around a tailing piles and dry stacking. At the same time, the center that, FEA and the MPMG created, to monitor the environmental aspects, which include, regular mining dams, the dams that are under decharacterization. Will also include, tailings piles, dry stacking, and mining waste piles in general. The objective here, is to move towards having the first, Minas Gerais and then eventually national database that also include mining, tailings, and waste piles and dams collectively. Okay. This is going to be one of the layers, in phase 3. Currently the SIGA is working on the phase 2, which is focus on the upstream tailings dams that need to be decharacterized, and phase 3 will address the dry stacking and the tailing piles. And with that, I conclude what I had prepared to present, today. Thank you very much.
Perspective. Thank you very much. I invite Professor Lee to be admitted in the transmission room so that we can move towards questions from the audience, Q&A from the audience. Would you help us with that, Juan? So you can see there a question from an engineer from Brazil. He addressed the questions specifically or focused to Vicente Mello, but Professor Lee, if you can also share with us your perspective, it would be very interesting. A DCE, for your knowledge, is a declaration of the stability condition of a tailings dam, which is a requirement by Brazilian current legislation after the two very grave disasters that we have had. So Vicente, if you can start, and then now so that Professor Lee can sort of see if he can bring some contribution from the UK perspective.
So thank you, Luiz Guilherme. This is a tricky one,
They are all going to be tricky, Vicente. What did you expect?
No, it's fine. I'm used to the tricky ones. I guess, the best way to start this is that, the law is there to be followed, whatever is the law, first of all, okay? And if that's the law, that's what we need to follow. What are the challenges and specifically related on how the law in Brazil deals with this requirement of having 2 times a year, someone to issue a document that declares that a structure is stable? Is that the challenge and the challenge that the process that we face brings to us, is not static. It changes. It's a moving challenge, and when you bring, a process that addresses that in a statical manner, the fact that, today a certain, structure has a positive DCE does not mean that there will be changes for worse or for better 2 or 3 months down the road. It's like, you walk into your doctor today and you present to your doctor all your checkups, your medicals, and you've been keeping a good diet over the last 6 months, you've been exercising, you have not been drinking, you have not been smoking, and your exams show that you're well, and then he declares that you are not going to die, okay? But then you leave the doctor room and then you say, guess what? I'm going to start drinking, I'm going to start smoking, I'm going to stop exercising, and guess what? No diet, Your health is going to deteriorate, okay? Because it's a dynamic challenge, that can't be addressed by a static approach, There has been significant improvements when Resolution 95 and the mining law of 2020 brought the engineer of record, and companies, and one example is Vale, have taken that in consideration, that now the structures they are followed, by the engineer of record continuously, not twice a year, and the engineer of record publishes monthly reports on the structure, based on the data and how the structure is behaving on a month-to-month dry period, rainy season, and twice a year. That report then is sent to the regulator, but the engineer record can change the statement at any time, So it's one interesting manner to apply, and to stay within the law, but bringing the dynamic component into this analysis and not staying only focus on the static approach twice a year.
So in the UK, we have no equivalent of this. The nearest that we could get to it would be provisions in corporate annual reporting. And our company law says that a company always has to take account of the impact that it might have on society and on the environment in the course of its operations. But it's unlikely that our corporate reporting would go to the level of detail that you would really need to know, in fact, that structures were safe, for example, because the annual reporting mechanisms will be really quite general in their nature. The second thing we do have at a regulatory level is a requirement in every environment permit that, first of all, there are fit and proper persons employed to control the waste facilities operated by the company. So there's a sort of technical expertise requirement written into that legislation. But of course, again, that's not necessarily a guarantee. All it's a guarantee of is that the company employs someone with an appropriate certificate professionally. It says nothing about the capacity of that person within the corporation to influence the activities of that corporation and to make sure that corporation is doing what it needs to do. As part of that fit and proper persons requirement, there is also something else, and that is that all waste facilities, including mining waste facilities, should make financial provision for the harm caused by the waste facility. That's a very general requirement because it applies to landfill in the same way it would apply to mining tailings or even just waste storage. Experience of that in the UK has not always been great because the truth of the matter is that what has happened in a number of occasions is that where a real problem becomes manifest, very often the company will simply wind itself up as insolvent, leaving only the financial provision that's put in place to take care of the problem. And usually, and not on, it's very, very often, it turns out that that final financial provision is not adequate to cover the harm that's actually threatened and to restore or remediate the problem.
Thank you, Vicente and Robert. Moving forward, I would ask Juan to invert, and I was going to ask to invert Juan and publish Bruno's question at 11:06 to Professor Lee, and then we would ask Vicente to comment as, let's say, the opposite that we just did. Bruno Rodriguez at 11:06. Juan, please. So this question was specifically addressed to you. No, it's 11:13, Bruno. Sorry, Juan. Sorry, I messed that up. 11:13 or 11:10. It's what Andre put at 11:13. Thank you, Juan. Sorry for the mess up. It's longer than it's in the screen, Professor Lee. So
yes.
After you read it, I'll ask Juan to continue the question.
Yes. So, I mean, there is no question that certainly in the UK and in the UK scenario, the biggest cause of likely failure of a stack is the water flow through that stack and the capacity of that water flow to undermine the stability of the stack. All of our legislation seeks, certainly when the stack is operational, to try and ensure the adequate engineering, for want of a better word, of the water saturation through the stack. And that's, revisited on quite a regular basis. And of course, there's careful monitoring through tremor monitors and so on of the stability of the stack, leading in theory, to regulatory intervention. Should it seem that there is a danger of the failure of the tailing stack because of water ingress. I say in theory because in the UK, whereas we once had a quite significant mining industry, there is actually relatively little mining going on, and it's quite well dispersed throughout the UK. So that there is a real shortage of expertise in the UK. I think that's true at both an industrial level, but it's certainly true at a regulatory level. And therefore, there is a problem in the UK, I think, of people with the requisite geotechnical experience. And it's an aging community in the UK. After the recent landslide failures that have been in Wales, I was asked by the Secretary of State for the government to act as legal advisor to a panel of experts, all of whom were experts in mine waste. I think I may have been the youngest on the panel, and I'm not very young. It's a community of expertise that is aging and not actually being replaced. And the lack of mining in the UK also means that quite a lot of our expertise on graduation from mining schools disappears very quickly to other countries and works in other countries. Given the relative paucity of mining in the UK, there aren't really the jobs in that community to support a very active community of geotechnical engineers.
Thank you, Professor Lee. Before I pass the word to Vicente, if you allow me, Professor Lee, that having links with Imperial College, having been there, not only the original Aberfan report is publicly available in the internet, but there was a report relooking at Aberfan 50 years after, coordinated by Dr. David Height and colleagues from Imperial College, and that is also available in the internet. And going to the sort of a soap opera perspective, I chatted a lot with Imperial College people, and in that TV series, The Crown, there is a specific episode, if I am correct, on series number 3, that is the whole episode was with Aberfan. And David Height told me that it's quite what it's a good perspective or remake of what this is about. So I recommend to the audience, if they want to go back in history and study Aberfan. So I pass the word to Vicente now, if you want to comment. Juan, put the beginning of the question, which Vicente may need to refresh his memory. Bruno Rodriguez at 11:10, as posted by Andre at 11:13. That's it.
Thank you, Luiz.
Scenario, question mark, Vicente.
So I think, legislation, which is the question, if legislation could be explicitly a worst case scenario, this is basically what's applied to dams, but also legislation brings a credible scenario, we need to focus on, if we do have structures, either a dam or a pile that is not susceptible to liquefaction because of the materials, okay? The worst case scenario, the failure mode is going to be differently, it needs to be, at the same time, the scenario that brings into consideration the worst that could happen, but needs to be pragmatical. It needs to be something that can happen, regardless of the probability. We're not having a probability discussion. If the probability is slight, is small, it's higher, but it has to exist in the field of whatever probability it is, and that's the tricky piece, oftentimes, and this is particularly challenging in these structures that were licensed in the past as a waste pile of overburden material. And then the mining operator informs the environmental agency that is going to change the material that's going to be deposited there. The legislation in Brazil does not require that structure to go through a new environmental impact assessment. You don't need a new license. You just inform and then you can start depositing it. How you factor into consideration what has been deposited in the past and how it was deposited in the past, and what's the material and what are the implications, from a geotechnical perspective, that's a huge challenge, because for, most of, the overburden waste piles in Brazil, they were not deposited in the past with, controlled compaction, technological, requirements and monitoring. So we actually don't know what's there, So this creates a situation which is very challenging once you start to deposit, tailings on top of that.
Just to say very quickly, that wouldn't be the case in the UK. In the UK, you would have to apply for a formal permit variation the moment you change the composition of the site.
It makes total sense, Professor Lee. Makes total sense,
It is.
That's one of the gaps and one of the risks that we have in Brazil.
Juan, I would like now to ask you to publish the question put by Aline Roque at 11:04, posted by Andre at 11:05, because I think that both of you could contribute a lot answering that question. I ask, as you just spoke, Vicente, I would like to ask for Professor Robert Lee to start, if you don't mind.
So as I said to you in the course of my slides, the European law, the Mining Waste Directive, in a sense, does this. So it applies a uniform body of law, both for tailing dams and for stacks. But that really covers just the framework of the law. So it covers the essential elements of the law, such as waste planning, emergency responses, etc., etc. But then once you drill into the actual permits themselves, then that's when you begin to get the variation of standards. And what European law does is produce what it calls best reference notes. So if you knew that you wanted to have a tailing stack of particular materials, then there may be, it slightly depends on what you're trying to do, but if you're doing something that's relatively standard, you may be able to get just a standard permit to do that, and the standard permit will incorporate all of the necessary steps for that particular structure. More often, actually, you have to get a bespoke permit. In other words, you can't just take a permit off the shelf and say, this will cover my dry stack. They will look at the composition of your mining waste, and they will look at the steps that you would need to go through in order to make any stack stable, and then they will issue conditions on a bespoke basis. In other words, they will say, for this particular waste in this particular vicinity, under these particular conditions, here are now the conditions that we will schedule to your permit. So in a sense, the law for piles and for dams is the same, but the permit contents are very specific to your operation.
Vicente?
Thank you, Professor Lee. If we look into that from the Brazil perspective, when we analyze legislation, we basically have three pieces. You have the law, you have the resolutions, and you have the decrees. Okay. It would be similar to the UK. The law by itself, it's the 14066 federal mining law, and it's broad enough that defines the key major requirements. Oh, you need to have an emergency plan. You need to have an engineer record. You need to have this. So perhaps, the lacking here is that the resolutions focusing on dams, it has advanced a lot in a great level of detail. And one of the examples of that is CBM. You open and you have all mining dams there. Who built it, volume, year of construction, number of raises, volume, construction method, instruments. There are reports for the maintenance, the inspections, and all that. There is nothing when we talk about piles. It doesn't exist. We don't have a catalog, that you open and you have that, these are the number of piles, this is the design, this is that. So perhaps what we are lacking, is the detail that Professor Lee described, that addresses the specific implications of this particular structure, and fills the gaps. The other aspect that legislation is not going to solve, is the governance aspect. A dam, you have a very clear moment that the construction of the dam stops, and the construction is a controlled environment. You can have the designer can have its team on site following up the construction. You have a contractor, you have the technology control. The contractor knows that it's a controlled build geotechnical embankment at dam. When you apply the same concept to a pile, the pile, the construction and the operation is the same. The comparison for this controlled moment that the dams go through, it's the experimental pile. It's an experimental embankment that you do it to select number of passes, types of equipments, geotechnical parameters, understand the material, you derive your parameters, and then with that, you move to the actual construction, which is the actual disposal at the same time. And you don't have a contractor doing that. It's the mining operating team that is building and operating the pile at the same time. You don't have this controlled moment. So the risks in terms of the governance aspects are very different. And legislation is not going to solve that, you know. Legislation is not going to solve that, you know. The person responsible for production will pick up the phone and will call the geotechnical manager and say, listen, your team is creating problems. It's slowing down production because it's not approving the layers that my team is building. I'm having to turn off the concentrator. And this situation that I'm, you know, sharing happens frequently, you know. So it's a new way of mining, you know. Legislation is going to help with something. Organizational changes, cultural changes, new pieces of governance, what are the incentives so that they are aligned, will also be a requirement, especially with dry stacking and mining and tailings piles becoming more and more common as the predominant, you know, structures to receive tailings.
Okay, thank you, Vicente. I would like to move now, Juan, to Natalia Gomidi's question, posted in 58, because I think that links to what Vicente was talking with relation to the Brazilian authorities, and probably Professor Lee then can contribute from the UK perspective. And then I asked Vicente because the rest to the Brazilian mining the Brazilian mining agency. Professor A&M is the Brazilian mining agency.
So Luiz, I do believe that poses an additional challenge, you know. We should understand, you know, a dam, a pile, a dry stacking as a tailings storage facility, you know, and the you know, regulatory responsibility and oversight about the TSFs should be, you know, consolidated, you know. This will create more synergies among the team, will share knowledges, you know, will promote lessons learned, best practices, and will avoid, you know, conflicts in terms of, you know, tougher requirements related to a certain structure when in comparison to another one. We should understand that they are tailing storage facilities, and the concepts are applied in a certain way if it's a dam, it's applied in a different way if it's a pile, and so forth and so on.
If you allow me, Professor Lee, before you contribute with your perspective, I foresaw, Vicente, you mentioned in your presentation a slide of Xingu. Xingu
Yes.
was conceived as a drain stack, built as a drain stack, but the development of the legislation led to it being classified as an upstream dam. So when I read Natalia's question, without knowing if you or if she was relating to your picture of the Xingu dam or stack, when she refers for tailings dams and tailings piles, I read the question under the perspective of a potential difficulty to categorically classify a system of deposition either way. Would you have any comment on that before we pass the word to Professor Lee?
Sure. Thank you, Luiz. It's interesting, and perhaps it could be a little bit more interesting in this case if we use as an example the drain stacking of Germano, Cava do Germano, because the reclassification happened before the change in the legislation, okay? So the change there happened in 2017, okay? So basically, we looked into three components there, okay, when we started auditing on behalf of the prosecutor office. Whether or not there was a starter dike, what was the deposition method used, and in that case was hydraulic deposited, okay? And how the raises were done after the first raise, okay? So what you're going to find in the Germano pit, the Xingu, and a couple of other drained stacks, structures that were classified like that, is that the three of them had this. They all had a starting dike. The deposit method was hydraulic, you know, different than a process that you take the water out, either by filtering, either by other methods, and then you deposit a material with an ideal moisture content. That's not the case. Then you deposit hydraulic, and you let the structure drain, you know, based on a hypothesis that the material is self-draining or drains very well, okay? So the reclassification of the Germano, you know, pit was done based on those three things, you know. And what we discussed with Samarco was that we understood that that was a upstream raised tailings then before the legislation changed because of those three technical aspects, you know. It walks like an alligator, you know, it looks like an alligator, it eats like an alligator, so it is an alligator, you know, regardless if the name is a duck.
Okay. Thank you for your sharp answer. Professor Lee, would you comment from the UK perspective, this difficulty that sometimes exists to classify old structures which were not engineered when they were conceived and built?
Yeah, so two things really, I think. Certainly for new structures, we don't as such have this difficulty that Natalia has pointed to. I think there's fairly clear responsibility for the waste facility, whether it's a dam or a tailing pile. We do have a slightly different problem in the sense that you need both planning consent and a permit in order to operate. The planning consent comes from local government. The permit comes from the Environment Agency. In the planning process, planning conditions are applied. There is an overlap between those planning conditions and the conditions in the permit. But the planning comes first and the permit comes second. So there's a difficulty in harmonizing the controls so that they sit well together. At the planning stage, the environmental agency which will issue the permit is what we call statutory consultee. It has to be consulted. But we found out in the course of our research that the Department of the Environment Agency that handles the consultations is a standalone department. It's not then the department that goes to issue the permit for that site. So we have actually written a paper on this based on interviews with the regulators and with industry. And what we're actually proposing is a sort of twin tracking, a streamlining of the whole process in which the Environment Agency work together with the county authority and decide what will go into the planning conditions as a necessary component that for example, stack can be sited in this location, and make sure that they sit in harmony with the then operating conditions that will come from the permit. So that's a big issue. For Luis's part of the question, I mean, for historic sites, basically, actually, mainly under UK law, the categorization of dam or tailings wouldn't matter for the reasons that I've already said, really, that the essential framework of law that would apply. But the problem that I think we do have with closed tips and the sorts of tips that I was talking about in the talk that I gave is that, of course, once they're no longer operational, although you may still have the law in place, there are other elements that aren't in place. And one particular thing that isn't in place at that stage, any ESG pressures. Yeah, the mine is closed, the tip sits there. It may have changed hands. It may be in the hands of a new owner, but it's not operational, and all of those ESG pressures disappear. And I think that's a real problem, because actually, for a lot of what I see now, the ESG pressures are sometimes more important than the language of the legislation.
Thank you. I would like to go back, Vicente, to Zorzal's second question, who also posted at 10:54, which was a continuation of the first that we started our Q&A. And Zorzal is very concerned with the declaration of stability, as you can understand from his questions. So I think it's a good timing to bring that second half of his question, which is in the screen now.
Whether or not, piles need a declaration of stability, I think, regulation in Brazil will push towards that direction. I think it's going to be very difficult to have two sets of different requirements for structures that hold the same type of material, okay? But to me, the key issue is not this one. Okay, we can call the document whatever we want, DCE, owner's engineer record report, and it's the name is less important. The challenge, is it's something very particular to Brazil, Professor Lee. So the culture in Brazil, we love stamps. The thing that makes us the most comfortable is whenever there is a piece of paper with a stamp and a signature, That's why we have so many notaries in Brazil, that when you sign anything, you need to take to the notary, and the notary needs to sign and stamp it saying that you is you, okay? So behind this is the key issue. A piece of paper, regardless of the name, does not hold a structure in place. Fundamentally are the technical, good engineering approach, good monitoring, good operation, good construction that assures that a structure is stable and is safe, not a piece of paper, Whenever we let to a piece of paper to give us comfortness that a structure is stable, we perhaps could be facing unknown risks, or unknown information, and this reminds me the phrase that Paulo Sella always uses, from Donald Rumsfeld, a speech to President Bush upon invading Iraq, that Bush asked him whether or not it would work. He said, I'm not concerned with what we know that we know, and what we know that we don't know. I'm concerned about what we don't know that we don't know. And pieces of papers with stamps, whether they're called DCE or other names, they talk to us Brazilians very deeply. They give us sometimes a false sense of security that could not be there, Such a thing, it's a fact that the two failures in Brazil happened with structures that had declaration of stabilities issued, So the question is not whether or not there is a DCE or not, is how that DCE was obtained, what's the governance behind the data that was used, to be analyzed. The challenge is a lot deeper, and we are not going to solve it by, simple pieces of paper.
And if you both allow me to add, I don't want it to sound as a trick of wording, but in Brazil we also have overburden stacks, in a sense that our ore is always in such a situation that when opening an open pit mine, we generate huge volumes of overburden redeposit that stacks, huge piles of overburden. And that is the next year's challenge, isn't it, Vicente?
Yes, it is. It is, Luiz. What we have seen on sites, we're already facing this, is that there are, past assumptions that the overburden material, this material that, the iron formation is within, that we need to excavate and then redeposit in order to extract the ore, is a self-draining material, that would not require compaction or monitoring and all sorts of things. And what we see now in some of those piles with this overburden material is that those hypotheses, they do not hold, and we don't have a good catalog of those. We don't have instrumentation in those structures, they are huge structures, and definitely that will have to be in the roadmap in the future, Luiz.
Okay, just for Professor Lee's perspective, Professor Lee's, our ore deposits, we're talking mainly about iron ore deposits, and these iron ore deposits are on very steep topography. It's a very mountainous countryside, not hilly, but mountainous. Therefore, any of these stacks are, not very deep in a sense of a vertical thickness. But when you compare bottom elevation to crest elevation, they easily go to 200 meters, 300 meters high. This is what Vicente is mentioning. I would like to go on now, Juan, and ask you to please post Claudio Prado's question at 10:59. Because I'm sure Professor Lee already presented his perspective from the UK story or history, but I would like him to summarize it and then we'll move on to Vicente.
So in summary, Claudio, this will happen, I think, in Wales in effect, but it will happen only for the top category of high risk tips, and that issue of risk will be, as I said, I think dealt with partly by the threat that it causes to a receptor either being a community of people or while the environment itself, including the water environment. I think many of the old structures that we have are not necessarily posing a threat, sometimes more by luck than by good judgment at the time that they were built. But I think they will largely be left in place, and we will focus our re-engineering efforts just on that top category of high risk.
So, Claudio, in Brazil, in theory, that will not be the case, moving on. So one of the requirements of the new regulation is to conduct to do the as-is project for all structures in Brazil, okay? So that resolution recognizes that perhaps for some of the structures there is either no information or significant gap of information. And the objective of the as-is design is basically to fill those gaps, you know, and bring those structures to a,
just
you know,
to clarify to Professor Lee,
yes.
as-is, Professor Lee, is a substitute of as-built, as there is not an as-built documentation of an old structure. Nobody knows how it was built. Nobody knows the materials. The Brazilian legislation requires for an as-is. Therefore, you know, investigation is made. The best summary of the existing condition is put together. Sorry to interrupt you, Vicente.
No, Luiz. Thank you very much. And sorry, Professor Lee. I should have clarified to you. So the objective of the as-is is exactly this one: is to fill those gaps, you know, for those structures, you know. So eventually, when all the as-is projects have been concluded, you know, and we will have filled the gap, and we will no longer have unknown structures with gaps of information, and the as-is will allow the operator to identify needs to re-engineer, reinforcements, and other changes that, you know, should be done. The challenge that we are doing, you know, is that, you know, I had a boss that, you know, used to tell me that, you know, transatlantics, they don't do cavalo de pau, you know, they don't spin around. If you try to do a spin around in a transatlantic, it's going to break it, you know. But we Brazilians believe that we can create things that work perfectly here. So what's the challenge that the as-is is happening in Brazil, which is the same one in the decharacterization? Everybody goes to the market to buy the same services at the same time, and the supply chain has not been prepared, you know. So there is a lack of firms, designers, engineers, drilling machines, technicians, to do the as-is of 100% of the structures in Brazil at the same time, you know. So this process is being delayed because of this, you know. But eventually we will be there.
Just to add one thing about the UK in terms of information, just, you know, before 1976, you did not need a permit to build a dry stack. And that being the case, we are still discovering them in Wales. We are still finding stacks that we did not know about.
No, we've been finding tailings dams in Brazil also, Professor. So don't worry. It's you walk in your house and your spouse says, you know, I found an elephant living in our, you know, dining room, and nobody knew, you know.
Yes, full of surprises, right, Vicente?
Well, life has a lot to do, a lot of things for us to do. So,
well, I understand that we are coming to the agreed final time or the deadline of our webinar. I personally want to thank you both very, very much. A pleasure having been with you for the last 2 hours, Professor Lee and Vicente. I understand that representatives of ABMS, André Estevão, and from the British government, Natalia, are on the room. I would like to pass the words for them for their final words before we close the, I understand, very fruitful 2 days of upbringing the communities with the challenges being faced. André, Natalia, are you in the room? Would you allow them?
Yes. Yes, I am. So thank you so much for the webinar today, Vicente, Professor Lee, and brilliantly conducted by Professor Luiz. I think this is the start to discuss about what happened in the UK before, what we can bring as a benchmark for Brazil. We understand that the realities are quite different, but I think there are space for and room for developing this partnership and see how we can make the mining operations here, especially now with the dry stacking, safer, more transparent. And as Vicente said, the paper only have the issue that the tailings dams or the tailings piles are safe on a paper is not enough. So we need to see how we can improve the monitoring systems and how we can develop this even further to keep especially to keep the communities safer and in a more transparent way. And I believe this is the first UK-Brazil mining dialogue with ABMS. I hope we can have further discussions, not only with dry stacking, but also with other topics in the future. So thank you for so much for inviting us. And thank you, Professor Lee. Thank you, Vicente, for all the presentations here.
This was the first of many, Natalia. Thank you very much. For us, from ABMS, the Brazilian Society of Soil Mechanics, it was a great experience, jointly organizing this seminar with you, the British government. And before we end this session, on behalf of the ABMS, again, thank you very much, Professor Luiz Guilherme de Mello, for the brilliant moderating of this session. And even more, thank you, Professor Robert Lee and Vicente Mello, for the great presentations you gave, and even more, perhaps the great discussion we had in the end. It was certainly a big contribution to the subject that we know, especially for Brazil, is very important at present. This second session, as the first one yesterday, were excellent in terms of content, in terms of participation. The session from yesterday, for example, had already in about 24 hours more than 500 views so far on our ABMS channel. And this second session will be available there as well. So this will be certainly a big contribution in terms of knowledge added to the mining sector here in Brazil, as well as there in United Kingdom. And again, this was just the first of many seminars like this we will promote together. Thank you very much again. Well, I think this is the end of our very first webinar, UK and Brazilian.
Well, André, you know, I like to speak. I can't keep my mouth shut, so I use the opportunity to send you all and your families a Merry Christmas and a happy end of the year. Hoping that we are out of the pandemic times, back to normal life with our families. To all, Merry Christmas. Not only on the screen, but all the audience also, no doubt.
Thank you so much, and Merry Christmas, everyone. And hope
next
year will be better.
Merry Christmas to all. God bless us all. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you very much.
So long.
Bye.